Good evening. First of all, I want to tell all Argentines that I understand that the situation we are experiencing is difficult, but also that we have already covered more than half the road. This is the last stretch of a heroic effort that we Argentines are making, and for the first time in a long time this time the effort is going to be worth it. Secondly, today I am here surrounded by our economic team, headed by Minister Luis Caputo and the President of the Central Bank, Santiago Basili, to announce something that only a few months ago seemed impossible in Argentina, against the predictions of the majority of political leaders, professional economists on television and public speakers, specialized journalists and a good part of the Argentine establishment. I want to announce that the national public sector registered a financial surplus of more than 275 billion pesos during the month of March, thus achieving, after almost 20 years, a financial surplus of 0.2% of GDP during the first quarter of the year. This is the first quarter with a financial surplus since 2008, a milestone that should make us all proud as a country, particularly given the disastrous legacy that we had to deal with. This concept, that of fiscal surplus, which seems to be simply a technical definition that has no bearing on the lives of Argentines, is neither more nor less than the only possible starting point to end once and for all the inflationary hell that Argentina has been since the fall of convertibility. Having become the world's biggest serial defaulter and having the highest tax pressure in the world, the fiscal surplus is the cornerstone on which we build the new era of prosperity in Argentina. Having achieved this surplus in Argentina, which has had a deficit for 113 of the last 123 years, with this government having received a consolidated deficit of more than 15 points of GDP, between the Treasury deficit and the central bank deficit, and having adjusted 13 points of that 15 in just 3 months of government, is simply a feat of historic proportions at a global level. For this reason, I want to take a few minutes to explain to everyone what we were up against, how we managed to accomplish such a feat, and why it is so important for the life of all Argentines to maintain this course. I have explained on repeated occasions that when we took on the enormous challenge of leading our nation, we found a bankrupt country on the verge of hyperinflation. We had a deficit of 5 points of GDP in the Treasury and a financial deficit of another 10 points in the central bank. We had an exchange rate gap of almost 200% between the official dollar and the free dollar, and a monetary surplus similar to the one we had before the Rodrigazo, one of the worst crises in our history. Added to this, we had an unrecognized debt with importers for more than $50 billion and a debt in pesos for the equivalent of $90 billion. The agreement with the International Monetary Fund was down, and, during the first week of our government, inflation was running at 1.2% daily. That is, we took over the government with inflation running at 7,600% annually, with a monetary surplus and a bankrupt central bank that would have driven inflation to 15,000% annually. This means that we took over the government with a monetary surplus worse than that of the Rodrigazo, a destruction of the central bank's balance sheet worse than the hyperinflation of 1989, and social indicators worse than those of the 2001 crisis. Which means that we were facing the worst crisis in the history of our country. For this reason, since we took over, we focused on 2 essential issues. First, we said that the cause of all the ills in Argentina was the fiscal deficit. Since as a result of the obsession of Argentine politicians with spending what we do not have and exhausting the sources of indebtedness and tax increases, they resorted to monetary emission, which is the only proven cause of inflation. We took the bull by the horns and announced from the first day that with us the deficit would end and, consequently, the monetary emission and inflation would end. Secondly, we said that given the seriousness of the situation that we Argentines had inherited, we We did not have time for a new gradualist experiment, and we moved forward with the most ambitious shock stabilization program in our history. This is how we have managed to achieve a financial surplus in just 1 month of government, a milestone that has no parallel in the history of the Western world. Today we can say without a doubt that, despite the opposition of a good part of Argentina's economic and political establishment, despite those who systematically question our ideas and despite those who directly proclaim our failure to return to power, the government was right and our plan is working. This economic miracle of achieving a quarterly financial surplus after almost 20 years, having received the inheritance that we received, responds, unlike what those who want the failure of this government usually claim, to a large extent to what we called chainsaw during the campaign and not as some say to the dilution of public spending. A method that has historically been used in our country. Of the 5 points of the treasury deficit that we have adjusted, only 0.4% responds to the loss of the purchasing power of pensions. A loss caused by Alberto Fernandez's disastrous mobility formula that we wanted to modify in the ley basis and that we later had to modify by DNU. In the face of the lack of will of some political sectors. The remaining 4.6% of adjustment that we have achieved is entirely due to the cut in public spending that politics used indiscriminately to buy wills. An immoral practice that explains a good part of the economic failure of the last decades. Having achieved the surplus in the way we did, that is, prioritizing the cut in spending and not the dilution of it, is extremely important because it gives sustainability to the public accounts. And because for the first time in a long time the cost of the adjustment is not passed on to the entire Argentine population, but only to those who benefited from the impoverishing model of the past. To mention some examples, we highlight the 76% reduction in discretionary transfers to the provinces. A toxic system with which the central power distributed resources from all Argentines to a few who submitted to the will of the national government. There has also been a drastic reduction of 87% in public works, historically linked to the festival of corruption that Argentina has been for the last 20 years. Where taxpayers' money was spent on roads that led nowhere or on projects that were inaugurated 5 times and never finished. In our model, infrastructure works will be financed by the private sector so that we will actually have the works that Argentines need, preventing that money from ending up in the pockets of politicians or their friends who are state contractors. In addition to these measures, we have reduced the structure of the state, eliminating 50% of political positions, closing unnecessary agencies that were used to persecute those who thought differently. We have also eliminated advertising. As you will have noticed from the reaction of the media, which with other measures resulted in a 22% reduction in the state's operating expenses. That is to say, contrary to what many claim, not only has it been possible to end the fiscal deficit, but we have done so in a way that is economically sustainable and morally desirable. Since for the first time in Argentina the just do not pay for the sinners. The fiscal surplus that we have achieved without forgetting those neglected sectors that have been the main victims of the impoverishing model, is why we have increased, among others, the first 1,000 days plan by 500%, which benefits 70,000 pregnant women. We have increased the school aid allocation by 311%, bringing it to $70,000. We have doubled the universal child allowance. Including the 27% increase in the month of March, we have doubled the food card, which is an assistance that directly reaches 3.8 million people. We have increased the aid for soup kitchens by 75%, accompanied by measures to guarantee transparency, eliminate intermediaries and end poverty managers. And we launched a system of educational vouchers to assist those families who send their children to establishments that receive state subsidies. All this was achieved against endless ominous diagnoses that were given when we presented our program in December. They said that making an adjustment of more than 1 point of GDP was impossible. That having a zero deficit in the first year was impossible. Well, we are making the impossible possible, even with the majority of politics, unions, journalism and a good part of the economic actors against it. And we are doing it, even with limited room for maneuver. Because Congress has not yet given this government the tools that all past administrations had. This fiscal result is not just a number in a table in the Ministry of Economy, but the guarantee of a sustainable and consistent path to end inflation forever in Argentina. It is no coincidence that inflation is plummeting and every month the inflation number is lower than expected. Particularly in the month of March, which in theory was going to be the most difficult month for public accounts. The perhaps most conclusive data that shows the correctness of our course is that we assumed a monthly wholesale inflation of 54% in December, which in annualized terms implied 17,000% annually and which today is around 5% monthly. We know that there is still a long way to go, but there is no secret. If the state spends more than it collects and finances this shortfall with monetary emission, then there will be inflation. This is the law of history. If the state does not spend more than it collects and does not resort to emission, there is no inflation. It is not magic. These are concepts that have been widely demonstrated throughout the history of humanity and that are rejected in Argentina for a very simple reason. Politicians want to spend a lot because they are the main beneficiaries of that spending. That is over with us. For us, the only task of the state is to protect the life, liberty and property of Argentines, so that each one can be the architect of his own destiny. The fundamental requirement to achieve this objective is to guarantee a healthy and stable economic order. These are the foundations on which the rest of the building is built. A stable economic order so that Argentines can associate, enter into contracts, buy, sell, work and trade freely. In other words, so that they can fully exercise their freedom and carry out their life project. A stable economy so that Argentines can save and plan their lives because they know that no one will take away the fruits of their work. A stable economy with a free price system, with clear signals so that those who undertake or carry out an economic activity can plan and invest because they trust that they will do well. That is the task of the state, to generate the basic conditions for society and private activity to flourish. Therefore, I want to take advantage of this opportunity to say to all those who hope that the way out will come from public spending, to all those, both in the world of politics and in the economic establishment, who believe that these successes are temporary and that we will eventually have to start increasing spending. I want to tell them that this will never happen in our government. Because for us inflation is theft and the fiscal deficit is the cause of inflation. Therefore, the zero deficit is not just a marketing slogan for this government, but it is a commandment. This means that every peso left over by the national state, far from increasing spending, will be returned to Argentines through tax reductions. We are going to promote a dynamic of savings and tax reduction until Argentina has a level of public spending and tax pressure in line with that of a country that needs to grow. Because the only way to get 60% of Argentines out of poverty is with economic growth, there is no other way. A growth process that is characterized today by 3 stages. The first will be determined by the combination of sectors that expand due to the correction of relative prices, such as mining, oil, gas and agriculture, together with the recomposition of real wages that has now begun to take place hand in hand with lower inflation. On the other hand, the low capitalization of the economy, the result of 20 years of populism bent on destroying capital, generates investment opportunities with very high returns. Finally, the reduction of the treasury implies returning 15 points of GDP to the private sector in the form of savings that will allow financing the investment that will generate genuine economic growth, which will be greatly multiplied to the extent that Congress supports us in the program of structural reforms, as is the case of the ley basis. Therefore, do not expect the exit from public spending. The era of the supposedly present state is over. It has been a resounding failure that has plunged 60% of the population into poverty, and we will never return to that. The exit will come from private sector investment and credit, genuinely financed by savings, because that is the only sustainable way to grow. Therein lies the secret of the success of all developed countries in the world. A state that looks after the life, liberty safety and property of individuals and a thriving private sector that risks, bets on the country and generates wealth. I would like to close these words by highlighting the enormous task that our economic team is carrying out, led by Luis Caputo and Santiago Basili, who, despite everything against them, decided to put their chests forward to try to get this country ahead, motivated only by the patriotism of knowing that decisions are made by those who are present. These men at my side, these patriots who had a country on fire before them, not only did they not turn their backs, but they ran towards the fire to try to help their compatriots. While others fled, they ran towards the fire. My gratitude and recognition to them. To conclude, I would like to say that none of this would be possible without the heroic effort of the majority of Argentines who are suffering, but who know that this is the only possible path if we want a better future for our children. There is not a day that goes by that does not amaze me and all those who accompany us. The fortitude with which Argentines are facing this challenge. There is no alternative but to surrender at the feet of a people who have decided to abandon slavery and undertake the long journey through the desert towards the promised land, with the commitment that those of us who are part of this government will give our lives to get this country out of the hell that we have received. Thank you very much. May God bless the Argentines and may the forces of heaven be with us.